So I want to suggest that the soldiers at Abu Ghraib have often aroused compassion and understanding. As a culture, North Americans appear to sympathize with many of them, perhaps believing the Milgram experiment to be a good explanation for behavior. So let us think for a minute what is produced by the story of corrupt leaders. And I want to suggest that that story, just as it did for us in Canada in the Somalia affair, that story produces a national innocence. Because it's not us who are bad. There's nothing rotten in Denmark, as Hamlet would say. It's really just a few bad men. And it's a strange time in American history. It's a time when, as the filmmaker Errol Morris said, our children have somehow been coerced into playing Animal House on the night shift. It's an interesting way to do it. So I'm going to show some clips from the film, and then I'm going to talk about our response to these types of framings of what torture is. Before I do, I just want to make one key point about this, which is that when other people talk about torture, for instance, the winter soldiers, those are the soldiers who have come back from Iraq and who are now holding hearings, testifying to the awful things they were made to do, the violent things, they do not receive the same response as the torturers at Abu Ghraib. There is no sympathy for them. There's very little coverage of their acts. And they are the ones who are consistently saying what I will argue has never been said by anyone associated with Abu Ghraib: I'm sorry. And so that's very important to keep in mind. So let me, I've been debating with myself when to show these clips because they'll set you on a track. Let me just say one more preliminary thing, which is that I'm going to make a big deal of the fact that we have never heard "I'm sorry," that we have never heard an apology, we have never seen remorse from anybody associated with Abu Ghraib, anybody. But I want to remind you, as other scholars have done much better than I, Nicholas Tavuchis, for instance, who's quoted by Richard Wiseman, that when you say "I'm sorry," there have to be three components. One is an unconditional acknowledgement of responsibility. The second is sincere self-condemnation. And the third is an awareness that the victim has suffered. And for Abu Ghraib, not only do we not have any of these, we have never even had a token "I'm sorry." And that is what we ought to think about when we reflect on what is the status of Muslim or Arab bodies today, post Abu Ghraib, because I think it's very important that that has never been done. Now, you might say to yourself that these kinds of, this expression of no remorse, no moral conflict, and so on, these kinds of, performances, if you like, where the practices of torture are described in great detail with, very little evidence of even conflict. We just turned on the showers. All we did was wet the detainees until it was hard for them to breathe through the hoods. This kind of thing. Or Sabrina Haman is able to draw diagrams in her letters home of how they use dogs on prisoners. This sort of participation, the mundane work of torture elicits very little moral conflict. So I guess what I wanted to consider ultimately is the point, I think, well made by Richard Wiseman, to refuse to apologize or share remorse when it is expected may signify no less than the rejection of one moral universe in favor of another. And the moral universe that we are being offered in stories of torture, and this is especially the case, not especially the case, this is equally the case in critical stories of torture as they are in non-critical Fox News stories of torture. The moral community that we're being offered is that Iraqi bodies are not worth counting. I want to end with a last sort of example. When I began writing this paper as a story of how cultural difference is used, I was actually in Irvine, California, and an intriguing story appeared in the Los Angeles Times. This was a story of Blackwater, you know, the hired mercenaries, shooting, a Blackwater shooting where 17 Iraqis were killed. And so the headline in the LA Times, Blackwater shooting highlights a US-Iraq culture clash. Well, I, of course, was immediately intrigued on how a massacre of 17 people was actually a culture clash. And so I, read on, and the interview, the journalists had, began quoting. So there was the son of an Iraqi man, Abu Ghriab, strangely the same name, noted that, the Iraqis call it a massacre. Blackwater calls it a situation that arose because the workers feared for their lives, so they, had to massacre in order to protect themselves. So the big story that this news article was concerned with was that Mr. Razack refused monetary compensation. And here were US officials, apologizing. They weren't apologizing, but they were handing out money, monetary compensation. So the reporter offered this analysis of this very strange situation where you have someone who's refusing monetary compensation. And he says, far from bringing justice and closure, the investigations underline the friction between Iraqis and Americans. And it turns out that it's an unbridgeable gap. And what is the unbridgeable gap? US officials painstakingly examine evidence and laws while attempting to satisfy victims' claims through each cash compensation. But unfortunately for these law-abiding people who are busy calculating compensation, traditional Arab society values honor and decorum. The perpetrator admits responsibility, commiserates with the victim, pays medical expenses all over glasses of tea in a tribal tent. And that is simply not what Americans do. So, as a former US diplomat concluded, our system is so different from theirs that I don't think that they will ever accept our way, and we will never accept theirs. Framed as a culture clash, the article then ends with the voice of another victim, a father of two who was severely injured and who also refused compensation. Finally, a third victim, and they're both saying the same thing. This person was a physician who lost his physician wife and his medical student son in this massacre. And he also said, I don't want your money. I don't want compensation. No amount of money will sweep this under the rug. He then added what he really wanted. He said, I want you to feel that Iraqi life is precious. It seems certain that the United States will not accept this quaint Arab custom of wanting to acknowledge that life is precious for them. Our system is indeed different to theirs. I want to suggest we are neither post-torture nor post-empire. And what these kinds of cultural explanations reveal is the perniciousness of Western refusal to grant that Iraqi life is precious. And that's where I'd like to leave it.